Questions without notice. Are there any questions? And I give the call to the Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, there are. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. I refer to the fact that over the last 30 years to 2022, the cash rate has been 1.3 percentage points higher under Labor than under the Coalition. Interest rates are always higher under Labor. And that under this Prime Minister there have been 8 rate rises in 8 consecutive meetings of the Reserve Bank of Australia Board. No wonder there is such pressure on the Reserve Bank Governor. When will the Prime Minister announce a plan to deal with the rising inflation problem in this country, which is fuelling higher interest rates? Why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Has concluded. Order. I give the order. The Treasurer will cease interjecting. I want to remind all members, when questions are being asked, that is not the time to interject, and when ministers are on their feet before they ask questions, it's not the time to interject. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, I'm asked a very broad-ranging question by the Leader of the Opposition about the history of interest rates. So I can inform the Leader of the Opposition that I have done a bit of research about the history of interest rates. I can inform him.
Order. The member for Deakin will cease interjecting. The member for Deakin, I want to deal with the member for Deakin. The Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting while I'm speaking. Member for Deakin has been continually interjecting every day in question time. This is not an excuse to yell when the Prime Minister has begun his answer. I want to be crystal clear about behaviour today. I'll give the call to the Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr Speaker. Notwithstanding the Leader of the Opposition's interest in my university essays, I can provide more for him later today. But I remember back in 2004 when the Howard government slogan at the election was keeping interest rates low.
Order.
I remember that well.
Order.
But then, of course, they made the fatal mistake of appointing the member opposite as the Assistant Treasurer in 2006. Now, at that time, the cash rate was 5.5% when he was appointed. But then the Reserve Bank met 3rd of May 2006, up 0.25%. 2nd of August 2006, up 0.25%. 8th of November 2006, you guessed it, up 0.25%. 8th of August 2007, do you think it went up or down? Hands up those who think it went up. Hands up those who think it went down. No, you're right. And then there's more. On the 7th of November 2007.
Order.
Did it go up or down? Hands up those who think it went up. Anyone think it went down? No. 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 6.75%. Today the rate is 3.35.
Order.
Is 6.75 higher or lower than 3.35? Sounds higher to me.
Order.
Sounds higher to me.
Order. Order. Members on my right. Members on my left. The member for Groom. Give the call to the member for Patterson.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Deputy Prime Minister, how will the Defence Strategic Review help prepare Australia to effectively respond to the changing regional and global strategic environment and ensure Defence's capability and structure is fit for purpose?
I give the call to the Minister for Defence and the Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank the member for her question, acknowledge her commitment to Australia's defence and also acknowledge the poignancy of asking a question about Australia's strategic posture on the 81st anniversary of the fall of Singapore. Yesterday, Mr Speaker, the government received the Defence Strategic Review from Sir Angus Houston and Professor Stephen Smith. It is a fundamentally important document. It runs to 157 pages in length. It contains 108 recommendations, many of which will obviously be classified. But more importantly than that, the Defence Strategic Review articulates a new strategic posture for our nation. Now, with apologies to those from the past for the crude simplification, over many decades, Australia's strategic posture has been centred on a defence of the continent, being a significant actor within our region and being a good global citizen. If you like, 3 concentric circles. And this frame has served us very well over a very long period of time. But quite obviously, in 2023, this is no longer fit for purpose. Because, Mr Speaker, today we live in a globalised, networked world, where as a trading island nation, so much of our national income is dependent upon trade. And so any potential adversary can do our country enormous damage without ever having to set foot upon our shores. And so our national interest lies in having a clear set of international rules of the road around trade, around freedom of navigation, the global rules-based order, along with having the capability to hold any potential adversary at risk much further from our shores. And in order to achieve both of these objectives, we need a defence force which has the capacity for impactful projection across the full spectrum of proportionate response. Now, Mr Speaker, the theory is important, but what's absolutely critical is that we now build a defence force which has the capacity in its specific platforms and people to be able to achieve this strategic posture. And this is exactly what the Defence Strategic Review examines. Time will tell, but I believe this document will be a blueprint for defence thinking for many decades to come. The government will consider the review over the weeks ahead before we release an unclassified version of the review along with the government's response to it. But far from being the culmination of a process, this is really the beginning of a new era in strategic thought, which will build a strategic posture for our country, which will protect our national interests, protect our way of life and keep Australians safe.
The member for Canning on indulgence, or is seeking to call for a question?
I've got a question.
I give the call to the member for Canning.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. At 4:01 p.m, the Minister tweeted a photo of himself and the Prime Minister receiving the Defence Strategic Review. At 9:42 p.m. last night, reports emerged in the media outlining recommendations contained in the DSR. Can the Minister explain how highly classified information about Australia's national security ended up in The Australian within a matter of hours?
Order. Give the call to the Minister for Defence and Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the member for his question. It is not going to surprise members of this House that there is speculation around the Defence Strategic Review. And the only thing that you've read in the newspaper is that speculation.
Order.
Now, the facts which are on the public record are the facts as I have presented them in the answer to the previous question. And it genuinely surprises me that on a matter as significant as this, the opposition would be sharing in the speculation of the press.
Order. I give the call to the member for Bendigo.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Industry and Science. How will the National Reconstruction Fund help Australia respond to national challenges, and what obstacles are there to achieving this?
Give the call to the Minister for Industry and Science.
Well, thanks, Speaker. And if you want to see a champion for manufacturing, particularly in our regions, look right there. Thank you very much for the question. Knowing how important it is for regional communities to be able to have access to great manufacturing jobs. And from our point of view, we all went through, obviously, a very seismic event with the pandemic, impacting on the ability to get the goods that we needed at the time we needed them most. We are determined to learn the lessons from the pandemic, address those supply chain issues and through the process be able to tackle inflation and put downward pressure on interest rates. So the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund that will be independently run will focus on a number of priority areas that will address some of the challenges that we've got. And the 7 priority areas, evidence-based, to help future-proof our economy following the pandemic. And the priority areas themselves informed by CSIRO work, particularly the COVID-19 Recovery and Resilience Report, that identified opportunities for Australian businesses to leverage science and technology and to drive economic recovery, resilience and realise positive economic impacts starting right now. So we are looking at setting up priority areas, for instance, value add in resources, value add in agriculture, renewables and low emissions technologies, medical science, transport and also emerging capabilities, defence, for example, and emerging capabilities like quantum, AI, robotics, and targeted investments within there too, driving value add in resources, for example, batteries, and being able to also see medical manufacturing emerge. Now, I'm asked about obstacles. Well, you know,
Order.
I mean, the time that we discovered that they actually had any opposition was the dummy spit trajectory through the Australian that told us that they weren't supporting it. We listened to the Shadow Minister's response to the legislation. The Shadow Minister apparently took umbrage that I wore black ties. I mean, I bust out the black tie twice a year and I'm a Kardashian. I mean, apparently also I was accused of being ambitious. Have you looked around? This is not exactly Australia's preeminent greenhouse for shrinking violets. There are a few ambitious people around. I'll tell you what we are ambitious for. Australian people, Australian manufacturing. We're ambitious that this will be a country that creates good jobs, a lot of jobs, and builds on our know-how, and particularly in regional Australia opens up opportunity, and remote Australia as well.
Has expired. I give the call to the member for North Sydney who was on her feet first.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Recent research indicates it would cost $12 billion over the next 7 years to provide fair incentives to help all Australian households electrify. By electrifying, households would save in the order of $3,000 to $5,000 a year. Treasurer, last year alone you spent $12 billion on subsidising fossil fuels. Will you redirect this funding away from fossil fuels and instead spend it on helping Australian households reduce their cost of living?
Give a call to the Treasurer.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the member for North Sydney for her question and for her interest in what I think will be a really important objective that we share as a government with the member for North Sydney, which is to try and get people's power bills down. And one of the reasons why we've already invested or set aside $1.5 billion is because we understand that the pressures on families, a big part of that, is coming from higher energy bills, and so we want to do something about that in the near term. And we also want to do something about that in the medium term and in the longer term.
The Nationals will cease rejecting.
And the Minister for Energy, the Prime Minister and others have flagged that we do have an interest in helping households get their power bills down by investing in better ways to get cleaner and cheaper energy, more reliable energy, into their homes. I think, as the Prime Minister said the other day, we are interested in doing that by incentivising people rather than compelling people. We think that's an important part of the issues that we're thinking through. And we share that objective with the member for North Sydney and with other members of the crossbench. And I think on our side of the House, everybody is interested in how we do that. So financial help in the near term, help with families and pensioners and households making the necessary differences in the medium term. These are all important parts of our plan, and we're happy to work with the member for North Sydney as we finalise it.
Give a call to the member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How is the government's commitment to the National Reconstruction Fund, the Housing Australia Future Fund and a safeguard mechanism delivering on its election commitments? How are these policies being received by stakeholders? And is there any opposition?
I give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member for Fremantle for his question, which goes to the fact that the Australian people voted for change on May 21st last year. And they voted for a government to implement the Housing Australia Future Fund, to implement the National Reconstruction Fund and to implement a fair income version of the safeguards mechanism that was, of course, designed by the Abbott government. A government that would invest firstly in affordable housing for veterans and frontline workers, for 4,000 households of women and children fleeing domestic violence. And I'm pleased that the member for Bass has announced her support for this program. I don't know why anyone would stand in the way of increased investment in social and affordable housing for Australian people, including the most vulnerable people in our community. They also voted for a government that would invest in Australian manufacturing, secure jobs, new industries, making our future here. We know from the pandemic that Australia needs more resilience. We need to make sure that we deal with supply chain issues. It's one of the issues that is feeding inflation in this country. We know that a majority of these jobs through the National Reconstruction Fund will be created in regional Australia, and that is why it is worthy of support as well. But they also voted for a government that would end the climate wars, that would move Australia forward. Our plan to fix the safeguard mechanism has been endorsed by industry and business. Origin, Rio Tinto, Shell, Woodside, the BCA, the Australian Industry Group, ACCI, National Farmers Federation and the Minerals Council. But I'm also asked, is there any opposition to these plans? Now, in every issue, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's housing, whether it be dealing with the challenge of climate change, those opposite have just one answer. The coalition have become the no-alition once again, saying no with no improvements.
Order. Prime Minister, order. The members on my right. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, you've previously ruled on the use of that term the Prime Minister used, and you should be asked to withdraw it.
I'll just ask the Prime Minister to continue with his answer and not to refer to the coalition except by the coalition. Give him... Order.
Well, if they stop saying no, they're certainly not the yes-alition.
Order.
They're certainly not that, because they say no to housing, they're saying no to secure jobs, they're saying no to manufacturing, they're saying no to the safeguards mechanism, regardless of the fact that people out there are saying that it should be supported. They want the last decade to be like the next decade to be like the last decade, with its climate wars, with its delays, with its denial.
Members on my left.
We have positive plans for Australia. And I say this, if you've got no plans of your own, just get out of the way.
Order. I'd like to hear the Deputy Leader of the Opposition in absolute silence. And I give her the call.
The question is to the Prime Minister. A CanStar consumer survey has found 59% of people cite the cost of groceries, rent, electricity, gas, interest rates or petrol as their #1 concern for 2023. And after 9 months in office, the Prime Minister doesn't have a single policy to put downward pressure on interest rates. Why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Order. The Treasurer will cease interjecting. I give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for her question. I'd say to go and have a look at the evidence of the Reserve Bank Governor today, or the Head of Treasury, who spoke about the fact that our plans are actually making a difference. To name just one. To name just one.
Members on my left will cease interjecting.
Senator Canavan very helpfully asked the RBA Governor the following question today. Just on the energy side of things, how much has the disruption in energy flows resulting from the war in Ukraine contributed to inflation over the past year now? Almost. And the Governor said this, substantially. At one point, the price of petrol, I think the annual rate was up 30%. That makes a big difference. And the sky-high prices of gas and coal in Europe flowed through back into our domestic market. That's been a first-order issue, but it hasn't just been energy, it's been food and a lot of the supply chains. It's worked its way through. The more positive story here is we're through the worst of that. And for those opposite who are opposing positive plans like the National Reconstruction Fund, where the governor has also spoken about how supply chain issues were contributing to inflation, they're standing in the way of solutions to these issues, is just extraordinary. The same opposition came when we brought forward our energy price relief plan to this parliament in December. Those opposite voted against $1.5 billion of relief that was designed in a way in partnership with the advice from the Treasury to make sure.
Prime Minister will pause. I'll hear the Deputy Leader on a point of order, and I'd ask her to state the point of order.
On relevance, Mr Speaker, the core part of the question went to interest rates, and the Prime Minister hasn't mentioned the core part of the question.
Thank you. The Prime Minister was about households. It was about the Labor government's policies of 9 months. It was about interest rates. There were many components of the question. I appreciate the Deputy may have one important part of the question, but the Prime Minister is being relevant to the whole question. I'll give him the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, because we know that there are inflationary pressures in the economy, and that is what interest rates are related to, inflation. There's a relationship between the two. I would have thought that was pretty obvious, and that is what the evidence today was there. That's why we have put in place our three-part plan of relief, repair and restraint, making sure that we provide relief, that we provide repair through issues like supply chains and the skills crisis, and also that we have restraint when it comes to fiscal policy, so that fiscal policy is working in concert with monetary policy as well. That is the plan that we are putting forward, a plan that's constructive, a plan that is positive, and those opposite have nothing to say except one word: no to everything that is put forward.
Give the call to the member for Higgins.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. How is the Albanese Labor government reforming the safeguard mechanism to ensure Australia's biggest emitters contribute a fair share of emissions reductions? What are the consequences of uncertainty in energy and climate policy?
Give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and thanks to my friend the member for Higgins for that question. What a passionate advocate for the values of the people of Higgins she is, Mr Speaker. What a contribution she's made in her time in this chamber so far. And this government went to the election promising to reform the safeguards mechanism to reduce emissions from a sector which represents 28% of Australia's emissions. We're talking about reducing emissions by 205 million tonnes by 2030, Mr Speaker. So this is a big and important deal. And it's also important for industry to provide certainty, Mr Speaker, to provide stability. And that's why this reform has been backed by the Business Council, the Australian Industry Group and ACCI, who have all released statements calling for this package to pass the parliament, Mr Speaker. So industry certainty is key. But I tell you what is not industry certainty. That's flipping positions between last year and this year. And yesterday the Shadow Treasurer was asking the Prime Minister about something he said in 2006. Well, in 2021, the member for Hume was backing safeguard crediting, Mr Speaker, not that long ago. In 2021, the member for Hume said the new safeguard crediting mechanism would provide an incentive to businesses to reduce their energy costs and emissions by undertaking transformative projects. And that's exactly what we were proposing in the safeguard crediting bill, Mr Speaker. And industry certainty is also important when it comes to putting downward pressure on prices. Now, that's why we intervened in December to act on energy prices, Mr Speaker. And this is important for households and small business, but it's also important for big business and industries, because big industrial producers are also big energy users, Mr Speaker. That's why the Aluminium Council backed our intervention, saying the Council welcomes the actions of the government to meaningfully address gas prices in the short term and medium term and a stepping stone to a long-term solution. So the opposition cries crocodile tears about big industry, but they weren't there for big industry last December when the government was acting, Mr Speaker. We know they voted against it. Not only we know that,
yelling.
they're against it. The Shadow Minister issued a press release on certainty on the 1st of February, and he accused us, and he said our energy intervention was disastrous, then complained it was too late. He said we should have acted sooner, so it was disastrous and too late, and then said it was rushed. So in one press release, Mr Speaker, he said it was bad, too soon and too late. I mean, they can't get certainty in one press release, Mr Speaker. He made more sense in Hiroshima, where he issued a video saying, "Hiroshima, what can we learn from nuclear?" Mr Speaker. That's what he made more sense. He was on the world's worst Kon-Tiki tour promoting nuclear in Fukushima and Hiroshima, and he made more sense then than he does defending their policy certainty, which is completely non-existent.
The Minister's time has concluded. Order. Members on my right. The Minister for Industry. The member for Fairfax, I can hear every word you're saying. You need to yell. Trust me. Order. I want to hear from the member for Hume.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Under this Prime Minister, interest rates have increased at the fastest rate since the Reserve Bank began targeting inflation. By how much does the current inflation rate exceed the RBA's target?
Order. The Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I'll begin and then I'll give the Treasurer a crack. The Treasurer a crack.
Members on my left.
Because he deserves a go.
Members
he deserves a go because I lead a cabinet-level government. I lead a cabinet government in the best traditions of the great Bob Hawke. And that's why we have ministers, so they can do their job. But our plan to deal with the inflation challenge within the economy is relief, repair, restraint, providing responsible cost of living relief, repairing our broken supply chains, which have been made worse by their actions opposite, but also come on.
The Prime Minister will pause, and he's 45 seconds into his answer. All right, resume your seat. No, there's no point of order, and I call the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And of course, showing spending restraint in the economy. And I pay tribute to the Treasurer and the Finance Minister in the other place, who do such a fantastic job of making sure that we put together a responsible budget last October, and there'll be another one in May. And I ask the Treasurer to add.
Thank you.
The Leader of the
Mr Speaker, I think if the Shadow Treasurer needs us to tell him what the inflation rate at 7.8 and the target rate of 2.3%, then we've got even bigger problems than we feared about old mate over here. Old mate over here needs the most simple concepts explained to him very slowly, and that's what we're happy to do over and over again. Now, the reason, Mr Speaker, why the member for Hume didn't ask me this question is because he knows that last week I was tuning in, as I always do, watching Kieran Gilbert on Sky interviewing the Shadow Treasurer, and he was asked by Kieran Gilbert on Sky last Tuesday. Kieran pointed out to him, as we have from time to time, that interest rates started going up on their watch. We've also pointed out that interest rates were more than twice what they are now when the Leader of the Opposition was the Assistant Treasurer. But I was watching Kieran talk to the member for Hume last Tuesday, and Kieran said, look, but you did see interest rates go up on your watch, and the member for Hume said, well, you saw a 0.1% increase in May. Now, the only problem with that is that is completely and absolutely wrong. The only apart from that fact that he got wrong, the rest of it was right, Mr Speaker. He was asked about May, And in May, when those opposite were in office, interest rates went up by 25 basis points. I think everybody on this side of the House understands that. The Shadow Treasurer does not have a clue. He does not have a clue, and that's why he doesn't ask me the question, because he knows I'm watching Kieran Gilbert talking to the member for Hume, and he knows that the member for Hume dropped an absolute clanger on Kieran's show last week. The Shadow Treasurer of this country, the guy that wants to be the Treasurer of this country, doesn't even know how much interest rates.
The time has concluded. The time's concluded. The time has concluded. Order, members on my. The Minister for Home Affairs. I can hear every word from you as well. I don't need to yell that out. When the House comes to order and there is complete silence, I'll hear from the member for Macarthur.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Why are the Albanese Labor government's climate change policies part of the government's economic plan, and are there any barriers to their progress?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the wonderful member for his question. He understands, just like we understand on this side of the House, that good climate change policy is good economic policy. And that's because we understand that the future of this economy will be increasingly powered by cleaner, cheaper, more reliable and increasingly renewable energy. We understand that. And we also understand that for too long in this country, the opportunities of an economy powered by that cleaner and cheaper energy have gone begging, while we've had this ridiculous war over climate change policy which we want to bring to an end. And we're doing that. We want to bring that climate change war to an end because we understand that the economic imperative for acting on climate change is great, and that's why cleaner and cheaper energy is such a central part of our economic plan. It's why we legislated our emissions reduction target. I pay tribute to the minister. It's why we're progressing our Powering Australia plan and the Powering the Regions Fund. It's why we've got an agenda for climate risk disclosure and sustainable finance as well. And it's why we are determined to deliver a safeguard mechanism so that we can end the policy uncertainty, provide a credible pathway to net zero and give business and industry the confidence that they tell us that they need to invest. Now, making this transition is absolutely crucial for the future of our economy, for creating new jobs in new industries, but also for leveraging our traditional economic strengths and for providing that investment certainty. And that's why the business community, as the Prime Minister said a moment ago, and Australia's big employers are begging this parliament to support the passage of the safeguards legislation. The Business Council have done a heap of work, including this great report in 2021, and we commend them for it. They told this parliament to get on with it. The Chamber of Commerce has said, for the sake of certainty, this must pass the parliament. The Australian Industry Group says it is strongly in everyone's interest to pass it. And they are right. It is in everyone's interest for the future of our economy and our climate and our country. It's incumbent on every member of this parliament to set aside self-interest and act in the national interest and pass the safeguards legislation. Now, by standing in the way of this progress, the Leader of the Opposition is standing in the way of investment and industries and jobs. He is showing himself to be a more destructive version of Tony Abbott and a more divisive version of the member for Cook. Now, nothing would make those opposite happier than to waste another decade bluing about climate change policy while the economic opportunities go begging. We have a plan for climate change because we want to make that a central part of our economic plan as well. For too long, Australians have paid too hefty a price for the failures of those opposite to get behind sensible policy like the safeguard mechanism in the interests of our economy.
Order. I give the call to the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has failed to deliver his promised $275 cut to electricity prices. The Prime Minister has also failed to deliver the financial support he promised families last year. Can the Prime Minister advise the House how many more Australians will be forced onto hardship programs with their electricity retailer as a result of the government's delay in providing any financial support? Why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Order. Members on my right. The member for McEwen. I give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Mallee for her question, which goes to, can be summed up essentially as, why aren't you doing what I voted against earlier? that is basically what I'm being asked here.
Why'd you vote against it if you
What I said, what I voted against, $1.5 billion of relief, and now you're complaining that it's not being delivered early enough. But that suggests the question. Those opposite voted against $1.5 billion in direct bill relief. They voted against price caps. The member for Hume hid the price rises before the election and then misled Australians about it. They took 4 gigawatts out of the system and only put 1 gigawatt back. They had 22 energy policies and didn't land one. And then they come in here and say, why hasn't it all fixed? It reminds me of someone who comes home as a dog lover, and you come home and you find bits of the cushion everywhere. There's bits that have been torn out, and they're all over the lounge room. They're all over the kitchen. They're down the corridor.
Leader of the Opposition will cease objecting.
And you look at your pooch and you go, what's gone on here? And the pooch looks at your back and says, with those eyes saying, look at the mess you've made. Look at the mess you've made. I mean, fair dinkum. You did nothing for 10 years. You voted against when we had a plan, and then you come in here and say, why don't you do it earlier?
Order. I hear from the member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources. Minister, how will the safeguard mechanism bring certainty to the resource sector, and are there any threats to this certainty?
Give the call to the Minister for Northern Australia and the Minister for Resources.
I thank the member for Lingiari for her question and for her commitment to the resources sector. I'm asked by her about certainty in that sector and threats to it. Mr Speaker, for 10 long years, as you know, our resources sector was consistently let down by the former government and now those opposite. Those opposite denied climate change and any action on it. And you know what they failed to do? They failed to realise that Australia's resources sector is absolutely essential to Australia reaching net.
For a moment. The minister will pause. The minister will pause for a moment. I cannot hear a word she's saying. Order. The Leader of the Opposition. I give the call to the minister, and I ask her to be relevant to the question. I give her the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I was saying, those opposite, when in government, failed to realise that Australia's resources sector will be essential to reaching net zero emissions by 2050, not only for Australia but for the world. Without the resources sector in this country, the world will not reach a global ambition of net zero emissions by 2050. Now, I'm asked about the threats to certainty in the sector. Well, it lies opposite. There it is. Such is their disregard for the resources sector that they shuffled the resources minister out of cabinet. This is the largest export industry of this country, and they shuffled the member for Finkler out of there so the member for New England could get a promotion and a couple of extra staff. Well, what a legacy! What a legacy for you guys. And you, we remember everyone else's legacy in this House as well, don't we? We remember what the Greens did in 2009 when they failed to support the CPRS. What they did is teamed up with the Liberals and the Nationals opposite to make sure there was no action on climate change nearly 13 years ago. So all of those opposite, and I take the crossbenchers out of that, that is your legacy and the uncertainty you bring to the resources sector in this country. You are driving yourselves into the past, reigniting the climate wars. This country, the people of this country elected this government earlier this year because they wanted an end to the uncertainty you've created for the whole nation, for our economy and for our resources sector. I will ask, OK, Thanks very much, Leader of the Nationals. What does Woodside say about this scheme? What do they say about reform to the safeguards mechanism? Well, it will support a reduction in Australian emissions, as well as encourage businesses and industries to further innovate and adopt smarter practices and technologies in line with our collective emissions reduction targets. Look, they only employ 5,000 people. What would they know? But this is what they support. Everyone is accountable in this place, just like the 215 high emitters will be accountable for reducing their emissions under the safeguard mechanisms.
Order.
Everyone is accountable. You're going to be accountable for your vote on those opposite, pardon me, Mr Speaker, are going to be accountable for their vote on the safeguards mechanism, as are the Greens. We know this is how we will deliver lower emissions and a cleaner future.
Order. There is far too much noise. Members on my right, banging on desks is highly disorderly. Order. Members on my left. When the House comes to order and when there is complete silence, I want to hear every word from the member for Kennedy, and I give him the call.
Prime Minister, are banks in Australia's towns closing? Treasurers Keating, Hockey, Swan averred the majors will always be underwritten by government. Will you support North Queensland's industrial leadership in proposing a North Queensland postal bank initiated by the KEP? And note the curious inconsistency of two Liberal senators who in power sacked Holgate, the person actually creating a People's Bank. Out of power, the two want to look into it. Churchill observed, looking into it, you'll only see yourself how extraordinarily narcissistic.
There was definitely a question in there. I'm not sure about the end of the statement, but I give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Kennedy, not just for the question, but for his genuine commitment on these issues of services for people in his electorate. And of course, bank closures in regional communities is a very real issue out there. And I can inform the member that the Treasurer met the chair of the ACCC just today on this issue. And indeed, as well, we look forward to the findings of the report from the Senate Committee on Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport inquiry into bank closures outside of metropolitan areas. The member raises the issue of Australia Post, and that is certainly one of the options which is there. Aussie Post already plays a big role. In the 2022 financial year, they processed around 14.5 million transactions, with over 3,500 post offices currently providing banking services across the country. And I know that this was an issue that Christine Holgate has mentioned in the question. I think a fine person was advancing before the former government took action on the floor of this chamber to remove her, in part, of course, challenged by the inconsistency of the members that you raise. And one of the things about the member for Kennedy, whether you agree with all of his views or not, and on some of his views I agree, some I do not, is his fair income. Unlike the great pretenders who he refers to, the LNP senators out there who've discovered this issue after 10 years of government and doing nothing about it, have discovered it. One of them, of course, is famous for wearing high-vis in his backyard for media conferences and doing something that no coal miner would do, which is to smear coal dust on his face for the photo op. The member for Kennedy is fair income, unlike the pretenders over there in the Senate who pretend they care about regional Australia but never actually stand up for it.
I give the call to the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Action on climate change is a crucial part of protecting, managing and restoring Australia's environment. What will the impact on our environment be if this necessary action continues to be delayed?
I give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Minister for Water.
Thanks so much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Canberra for her question, because she knows and she is representing her constituents when she says that climate change is already having a devastating effect on our natural environment, including through more frequent and more extreme natural disasters. Those communities that are cleaning up after floods right now will never be the same, just as those communities that lived through bushfires, like the 1920 bushfires, will remember forever the lives lost, the homes lost, the regional economies devastated. And these weren't just human disasters, these were ecological bombs ripping through our natural environment. Those bushfires, we're talking about 3 billion animals died or displaced from their homes. We're talking about 80%. The member for Macquarie knows 80% of the Blue Mountains area burnt to the ground. More than half of the Gondwana forests also lost in those bushfires. We cannot afford to relive this past decade of inaction when Liberal governments simply gave up on our environment, blocking action on climate change, sabotaging the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, ignoring the extinction crisis, pretending the mass bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef wasn't happening. Now, this is no surprise coming from the Liberals and Nationals. They've never pretended to care about the environment. But I think that Greens voters would actually be shocked to see Greens members of Parliament getting ready to sit next to Peter Dutton and Barnaby Joyce to vote against action on climate change. They would be shocked to see the Greens voting with the Liberals and Nationals against a safeguard mechanism.
The Minister will resume her seat. The member for Petrie, is seeking the call.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. I just asked the Minister to refer to members, including the Leader of the Opposition, by their correct title.
I'll remind all members under the standing orders to refer members by their titles.
Yes, I will in future, thank you. And as well as lining up to vote with the Liberals and the Nationals against a credible pathway to net zero emissions, they're also shaping up to vote against more affordable housing. They're also shaping up to vote against the National Reconstruction Fund. And we know that voting against a National Reconstruction Fund is a vote against Made in Australia. When the Greens and the Liberals voted together to stop the carbon pollution reduction scheme, we saw higher emissions for longer. I urge this parliament not to make the same mistake again, because we cannot afford another decade of inaction on carbon pollution. Our environment can't cope with that.
Order. I give the call to the honourable member for New England. The member for Lyons is warned. Give the call to the member for New England.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs. Oh, there you are, back there. I refer to the Labor government's recent decision, which now allows public...
I'll just ask the Minister, the Shadow Minister, to start his question again.
My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs. I refer to the Labor government's recent decision, which now allow public servants to boycott the Anzac Day public holiday and substitute it for another day of leave out of protest. Does the Minister agree with this decision, and were veterans' organisations consulted about it?
I give the call to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and the Minister for Defence Personnel. Order. Members on my left. The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. As I'm sure, as the member very well knows, to be able to facilitate the many commemorative events that happen here in Canberra at the Australian War Memorial, as well as the events that occur on the Western Front and those events that occur in Anzac Cove Every year, except when disturbed by COVID, many public servants are engaged to have to work on those days so that we as a country can properly commemorate those that have served our country in uniform on those very important days.
Deputy Leader of the Opposition will
As
cease
it relates
interjecting
to
immediately.
public servants more broadly, of course, he would have to direct his question to the Minister representing the Minister for the Public Service.
Order. The House will come to order, so I can hear from order. Members on my left. Give the call to the member for Bruce.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the stupendous Minister for Housing and Homelessness. What has been the public feedback on the Albanese government's landmark $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund?
Order. The member for Bruce will state that question with any other extra things in the question, with the minister's full title and no comment at the end. And I give him the call.
No adjectives, Mr Speaker, anymore.
Get on with the question.
My question is to the Minister for Housing and Homelessness. What has been the public feedback on the Albanese government's landmark $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund?
I give the call to the Minister for Homelessness, Housing and Small Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bruce for his question. I know that he has been a strong advocate for more social and affordable housing in his own electorate, both as a member in this place and also previously in local government.
Order.
Indeed, the Albanese government was elected with a plan to help tackle the country's housing
Member
challenges.
Barker.
Challenges
Cease
that have
objecting.
not appeared overnight, but have been there in the economy for some time. Indeed, our plan to establish a $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund, we have legislation in the parliament to actually establish it, the single biggest investment in social and affordable housing by a federal government in more than a decade. We want to get on and deliver this package of legislation. But before we introduced our legislation, of course, we consulted. We consulted experts, practitioners, academics, local councils, states and territories. We did the work to make sure we got it right. And the feedback is this fund is welcome and it is needed. Indeed, Kate Colvin, the CEO of Homelessness Australia, has said, and I quote, "Can I start by saying how important the fund is as a new mechanism to provide resources for social and affordable housing?" Mike Zorbas from the Property Council said, "The legislation," and I quote, "is an important first step to get government working together with industry to bridge the national housing deficit and stimulate new supply that Australia desperately needs." National Shelter has said, and I quote, "We cannot afford to have the Housing Australia Future Fund fail. And importantly, our plans are achievable." Indeed, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute said, and I quote, "What the government is doing is setting ambitious targets, and they are ambitious targets, but they're also achievable targets. The $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund will make a real difference to people's lives." And of course, the member for Bass over that side has acknowledged this. Most people on that side want to vote no to most social and affordable housing, but the member for Bass said, and I quote, "As the government, you are expected to solve these issues and I'm not going to get in the way." And I acknowledge the member for Bass for saying that, as I do acknowledge members of the crossbench who have been participating in the debate. And they, of course, want more social and affordable housing in their electorates. But I say to those opposite who are not supporting this fund, how are you going to go and talk to the public in your electorate who want more social and affordable housing? To those people that need homes in your electorate, to people who are on the public housing list in your electorate, what are you going to say? That you came in here and you voted no to more social and affordable housing for those that need it most?
The House comes to order. I give the call to the member for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, Sportsbet donated to the Shadow Minister about to become the Minister responsible for online gambling, and the gambling industry has extended hospitality to the Minister ever since. Sure, disclosures have been met, but clearly the practice is morally wrong and breaches 321 and 322 of the Ministerial Code of Conduct. PM, what's to be done about it, or is the government's and opposition's silence the return on millions of dollars of gambling donations?
I'll give a call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for his question, but it's pretty hard to argue there's silence when you're asking me a question in question time. I make that point to the member for Clark. My government is committed to donations reform. We're committed to increasing transparency, lowering disclosure thresholds, increasing the timeliness of disclosures, and the member will have the opportunity to vote on that during this term. The Special Minister of State has asked the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters to inquire into and report on the 2022 federal election, and that is one of the measures that they've been asked to look at. My government, including the Minister for Communications, is committed to harm minimisation. We're delivering a national self-exclusion register. Bet stop.
The Prime Minister will pause. I'll hear from the member for Clark.
Speaker, on relevance, the question very clearly goes to section 3.21 and 3.22 of the Ministerial Code of Conduct.
The question was also about a broad issue which the Prime Minister is directly answering. He is in order, and I give him the call.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. And I note that in the member's question, he referred to matters prior to the election. But we're delivering. We're delivering a national self-exclusion register, bet stop. We're progressing work around the classification of video games with gambling-like features. We're responding to recommendations from the parliamentary inquiry into the use of credit cards in online gambling. We're holding a parliamentary inquiry into online gambling, including the impacts of gambling advertising on children. And we're implementing the National Consumer Protection Framework, including the changed guidelines that we have introduced for messaging in advertising.
Give the call to the member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories. How is the Albanese Labor government supporting regional communities to rebuild following a natural disaster, and how does this approach compare to the previous government?
Give the call to the Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for the question and acknowledge the fantastic work she did during disaster response but also recovery, so much of which she doesn't spruik because our communities don't need it spruiked about. We know natural disasters have changed the lives of many Australians, and communities have been impacted across the country by floods, by fires, by cyclone and adverse weather events. And in those communities, they really don't need to be used as political pawns. And we have seen time and time again those opposite do exactly that. And unbelievably, the New South Wales Auditor-General has now found the New South Wales government has followed in the Morrison government's footsteps. Colour-coded spreadsheets which dudded local communities. A decision by all Cabinet members of the New South Wales
Order.
Liberal and National Government.
The Minister will resume her seat, and I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr. Speaker, the actions of the New South Wales Government are not within the Minister's responsibilities, and she ought to be directed back to the question.
On the point of order, I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
Thanks. To the point of order, the Minister is responding to how federal money was used. It's about how federal money was used, and the question specifically asks for how the approach of this government compares to the previous government.
I don't uphold the point of order. I was dealing with the matter with the member for Hume at the time, so I didn't hear exactly what the Minister was saying in full transparent. The member for Barker is warned, do not speak when I'm ruling on a point of order. I don't know how many times I have to say it. I'm just going to ask the Minister to make sure she's being relevant to the question, and I'll be listening carefully to what she says. I'll give her the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know the Morrison government showed an absolute arrogance and disregard for communities who suffered catastrophic events. During a natural disaster, the thing communities
Order.
need to know is that the government has their
The Minister
back.
will resume her seat. The member for Groom will withdraw that statement immediately. Order. I'll give the call to the minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And on this side of the House, we have communities' backs because we are delivering transparency and integrity back when it comes to funding. We won't waste regional dollars on inner-city swimming pools. And I don't know where those opposite were, those regional champions were, when our regional dollars went to the North Sydney pool. Where was the outrage? On this side of the House, we're helping our regions to recover, to rebuild and to grow. We've committed $1 billion in regional funding programs which will have a clear application criteria and transparent assessment processes. We've increased jobs with our $1.9 billion Powering the Regions Fund. We've prioritised access to Commonwealth-supported university places for regional Australians. We're delivering 180,000 fee-free TAFE places in 2023 alone, and we're wiping the help debt of nurse practitioners and GPs to practice in our rural and remote communities. We're investing $1 billion over 5 years for disaster risk reduction and resilience. We're delivering $656 million in our Better Connectivity Plan for the regions. We've introduced our $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund, dealing with the housing crisis in the regions, left by those opposite, and we'll establish the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund, because the lesson learnt from the pandemic was that we need to build more things here. And you know what? That will strengthen our regional communities, so perhaps you should get on board and vote for it. The Albanese government will continue to clean up the mess from those opposite. We'll implement funding and we'll deliver it to those who need it when they need it.
Before I call the member for New England, I'd like to advise in the gallery of joining us today former Senator and former Minister, the Honourable Chris Evans. A warm welcome to you. I give the call to the Honourable Member for New England.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister overturn his government's recent decision, which now allows public servants to boycott the Anzac Day public holiday and substitute it for another day of leave out of protest?
Order. Order. Give the call to the Leader of the House. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting. Give the call to the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the question goes to workplace relations issues, and if I can go through that. First of all, in terms of Anzac Day, we are in a room of 151 representatives, all of whom take Anzac Day incredibly seriously, all of whom on both sides have direct relationships with veterans, and as a government we share the view that every other member in this place shares about the significance and the importance of Anzac Day.
Order.
For the entire 9 years of the last government, a flexibility provision applied that applies to a series of workplaces around the country.
Under you.
A provision for almost the entire 9 years of the previous government, and you'll find businesses around the country have provisions where individual workers can choose to work on a different day and to switch days of public holidays, not as an issue of protest, but as an issue of flexibility that has worked for employers and employees across all public holidays around the country. Now, if those opposite believe that those rules that have been in place for their entire 9 years, if those opposite believe that those rules that are asked for by employers
the Deputy Leader of the Opposition
be in agreements all around the country,
cease interjecting.
If they actually want to draw a line under that because they think there's some sort of culture war to raise questions where none should be asked, then they may well want to go down that path. But for their 9 years, the same provisions applied.
As the Minister concluded his answer, I give the order. Okay, just when the House comes to order, give the call to the members on my right. Give the call to member for Blair.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for National Disability Insurance Scheme. How is the Albanese Labor government cleaning up the coalition's mess in the NDIS after the former government allowed NDIS participants to languish in hospital when they were medically ready for discharge?
give the call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services.
Thank you. As all members of the House would know, when the NDIS works well, it's life-changing. But when it goes poorly, it can be traumatic for participants. The fact of the matter is that at the last election, there were real problems with the NDIS, and all members deal with that. There was fraud, red tape, ballooning costs. But I think that there was no worse problem than bedblock. The fact that when we had people with disability eligible for the NDIS, medically fit for discharge, they couldn't leave hospital because there was no place for them to go. There were extremely long waiting times between when someone was medically fit for discharge and when they could actually get out. The Victorian Hospital Authority calculated that before the last election, it was about 160 days between when an NDIS participant was medically fit to be discharged, but another 160 days before they could be helped. That's too long. The reality is that this was costing the hospital system, it's blocking the beds, and it's a very poor outcome for NDIS participants. We promised before the last election time to cut the waiting times between fit for discharge and discharge, and we have. Promises made, promises kept. We've cut the red tape, we've put more people in to help wrangle the issues, and we've also given greater delegation to people closer to the hospitals. I've had the ability to visit hospitals in Western Australia, in Canberra, the Alfred campus at Caulfield. Marvellous staff and their resilient patients. The good news is that the waiting time, which was 160 days before the election, on average is now down to 33 days. The AMA calculates that this is saving the hospital system already somewhere between $205 and $584 million. That's in the order of $500 million. It's good for the hospitals, it's good for people who need to access hospital beds, and it's fantastic for people with disability who've been kept waiting longer than they otherwise should have. And what I say to Australians with disability and the people who love them, that this is only the beginning. The NDIS represents what's best about Australia. It's about helping others who are in trouble. It's about not leaving anyone behind. If we can't look after people with profound disability and their families, what kind of country are we? We are lucky enough to be able to not exclude from the opportunity of this country people with disability. We all should be proud of the NDIS. Shoulder to shoulder with Medicare, it's one of the best purposes we use our tax dollars for. Under this government, the NDIS will enable Australians, regardless of their impairment, to have lives of dignity and control, to have lives where they can make a contribution to community, a life of improved health, and that's our purpose.
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I ask further questions be placed on the notice paper.